In Daniel chapter 5, we're just going to recap the ending here of this in a brief way. We will leave Belshazzar to Darius, and we will continue on chapter 6 with Darius. So, Daniel chapter 5, remember Belshazzar was having a great feast. Remember the enemies were encamped on the outside there, and remember the writing on the wall, right? We talked about the wall. We talked about the plaster. We talked about archaeology and that. Also, when we come down to verse 22, it says, "Yet you, his son, Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart. You have not humbled your heart, even though you knew all of this." The very first thing he's done, he sinned against the knowledge of which he knew. He knew the story, right? Daniel took the time there that night, probably the biggest pause of the night before the destruction came. It was the calm before the storm, if you would. And he preached a message, didn't he? He preached a message to Belshazzar, and he had a great audience. And when he did that, he pointed the fingers, if you would, to him, and he says, "Yet you, his son." Now that's qualified, and I explained those qualifications there of how that all worked last week. Belshazzar, you have not humbled your heart, even though you knew all this. And we talked about Nebuchadnezzar, his Lyconian disease, right? We talked about how he became an animal in mind, at least. And he says, you knew all this, but you did not humble yourself. So when we sin against knowledge, when we know something, that is one of the most grievous sins we can commit. In other words, remember what Jesus said, going back to, if you want to look there, Matthew chapter 11, verse 23 and 24. You remember the passage. Jesus said, "I pronounce this judgment on you. It shall be worse for you than for Sodom and Gomorrah," right? And he qualified that. Because I did the work in your midst and you've rejected me. So they didn't have the light of Jesus right there at Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, they were still accountable. We could say general revelation, and we could go on. But because the more light you have, the more accountable we become. The more light we have, the more accountability. Belshazzar had a lot of light. Nebuchadnezzar left his reign and left it in good, really kind of good hands, right? With a proclamation, at least from what he's done from a political point of view, and a spiritual point of view, we might add as well. And then he says, verse 23, here comes the second indictment. "But you have exalted yourself against the Lord." Now, here's the thing. You have sinning against the light, sinning against the knowledge which we know. Then after that, this is a progression here. Then you exalt yourself, right? Once we sin against God, the knowledge we have, once we reject him, what's the next thing that happens? We exalt ourselves. Now, you see this all the time with college kids when they, grow up in Christian homes. They go out and then they find a different way, a different life. Don't humble their hearts. Don't acknowledge the light that was given to them that they were trained on. And what do they come back? They come back usually arrogant, right? They come back arrogant. This is a progression. And this is a progression that happened with Belshazzar as well. And this is always a progression. When we willfully sin against the light, the very next thing that happens is we exalt ourselves. And that's the second indictment. You have exalted yourself against the Lord of heaven, and they have brought the vessels of his house before you. And you and your noble wives and your concubines have been drinking wine from them. And third indictment, here it comes. You praise the gods, blasphemy now, right? Idolatry, all these things. So these are the three indictments. This is the progression. You sinned against the knowledge you knew. You exalted yourself, and then you go following after other gods. There's no other way about it. They are the three things that happen when you sin against the light of which you know. So that's the progressions here. And then we saw there in verse 24, then the hand was sent from him, and the inscription was written out. Verse 25. Now this is the inscription that was written out. Many, many tekel upharsin. This is the interpretation of the message. It's all kind of right here in our scriptures, isn't it? God has numbered your kingdom and put an end to it. Many, right? It's over. And I told you the historical setting of this as well. This is historical. This is archaeological proof. There's no doubt about how the Medes and the Persians captured the Babylonian Empire. You can YouTube it. You can read about it. You can go dig up artifacts about it, look in museums about it that have already been dug up. This is the way it was. The Medes and the Persians, I told you, the river that ran through the city, they dammed it off. They ran it into a swamp area, and they filled it up. Their soldiers went down through the gate in the middle of the night there, in the night of which this party was happening. That's what history doesn't tell you, right? This is special revelation here. We get an inside picture like no other piece of antiquity has given us, an inside glimpse of what happened that very night. So when they dammed up the river, they got down under the gates of the river, and their soldiers come up, and guess what? Everyone's in a party. It's an easy takeover, right? That's why I said last week that they really captured the city. They say you couldn't even see or hear an arrow fly. It was that quick, that simple. So, and Daniel just lets the king know it's happening now. So then, many, God has numbered your kingdom and put an end to it. Tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and found, I think King James says wanting. My version says deficient. It means that you don't weigh enough. We talked about the standard, right? You put the standard on the scale, you weigh it against the standard, and if it's too light, you didn't measure up. The New Testament tells us we've missed the mark with God. We never reached his standard of which he has for us. Perez, your kingdom has been divided and given over to the Medes and the Persians. So this is the head of gold. It's done. It's over. Here comes the train. That's a really neat train. Why does that train come? And maybe because of COVID, there's no Santa thing on it anymore, is there? Carol was on a train last week. I think she hijacked it or something because there's no people on that train down there. Did you realize that? It's only like the what do you call it? Not the caboose, the engine, and the second piece of material on a train. What's that called? I don't know. Second low engine. And there's a little guy driving it. So, and he just waves. I know, because I walk my dog down there. I don't know why he does it. And I heard the train whistle, so I know what's going on. All right.
You mean the one who's passed now?
Yeah.
He's going in to get the other pieces.
But he never has any other pieces.
He never came back.
It's always just him. I wave to him every day.
Yeah, there's always freight on the train. All freight during the week.
There's nothing on those trains.
I can see them
Sometimes
all.
they run them like from Vicksburg only to the monastery, like when they have the Christmas.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So he might be going in to pick up them run back and forth all day to the monastery, and then in the evening, he might be going back home, like he said, what he plays for. He might be going then.
Yeah, he was up to Claysburg.
Yeah, Steve mentioned,
He can go to Claysburg.
Steve mentioned with-
He comes a lot more than just going to Claysburg. Yeah, I don't know what he's doing. He probably works for the government. All right. It's a government job. He just get out there and ride around, right?
There's another train that comes up and down all the time. They get to, with Brickyard used to be up there, and they
Okay.
get to, New Spring.
Okay. Yeah, I knew they used to run for that. Yeah.
The one with. And then in the evening, he comes back up to Claysburg, and that's where they stored them.
Okay.
The Santa train's only on the weekends.
Yeah.
Okay, I didn't know if they stopped it because of COVID, because
No.
I haven't seen anybody
No, I saw
riding
it.
it.
When I come over to the-
Okay, all right, hey, glad we worked that out. Perez. Perez, yeah, we do. What's that? No, I just heard it again, and I just think of waving to the guy, and it's like, what does he do? All right. Perez, your kingdom has been divided and given over to the Medes and the Persians. Then you remember here, verse 29, then Belshazzar gave orders. They clothed Daniel with a purple and put a neck of gold around, put a necklace of gold around his neck, issued a proclamation concerning him that he now had authority as what? The third ruler in the kingdom. When you put the history together, it really clarifies a lot of things, doesn't it? Why the third? You really don't understand all that without the background of history. And then verse 30, that same night, here's the historical, this is where history comes to bear in upon this. Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was slain. That quick. Dies that night. The party ended, right? So Darius, the Medes received the kingdom at about the age of 62. So new ruler, new kingdom. The kingdom of Babylon is fallen. I won't say once and for all because there's a revived Babylon and the Revelation, but this is done. This head of gold under Nebuchadnezzar, under the reign there of Belshazzar, those who preceded him, is over. So we come to chapter 6. Now, in chapter 6, it's an interesting chapter because it is the last narrative section of the book of Daniel. After this, things will tend to get a little bit heavy into prophecy. So I encourage you to follow along. If you miss, jump onto the site, listen to the audio files, because it will get confusing probably if you don't. But this is the last narrative section. And as you can see, it's 28 verses long. So this is the famous story that you all know. So this is Daniel and the lion's den, right? So I just want to show you something before we turn to that. Look at chapter 7. It says the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon. Now we start to go back, right, in time. So keep in mind that this isn't in chronological sequence what's going to happen. But Daniel now is at the age of 90. Okay, we're going to talk about that. So he begins here with this reign of Darius. Now, as we just saw, Belshazzar is slain. Now, as I said last week, Darius was, the Medes and the Persians, they weren't a bad group of people. They really weren't. They didn't go in and create a whole bloodbath of everybody. In fact, Daniel's third ruler of the kingdom, right? And guess what? He stays alive. He still lives here in chapter 6, along with probably many others. But, of course, you slay the king, right? Because you don't want people to get around him. You don't want anything to stir up, so you kill the king. So Belshazzar's dead. It was an easy takeover. And they're able then to reconstruct the government there. And as I said, they kept many of the architects in place. It wasn't like they came in and battered it all down and destroyed the whole city. Actually, Darius is going to reign there, and it's going to be beautiful still. So it's not destroyed. It's not like they tore down the walls. It's not like they burned it with fire like you would normally have to break into any walled up city. So very unusual in that sense that this city gets to stand. Many of its people get to remain, but you have a change of leadership. And I talked about the change of leadership from a spiritual dimension as well, where they believe that Belshazzar, I won't get into all that. Okay, just going into chapter 6 here. It seemed good to Darius to appoint 120 satraps over the kingdom, and they should be in charge of the whole kingdom. So there's this kingdom. One thing I will say about kingdoms and nations, nations are born, they live, and they die. That's the cycle. They're born, they live, and they die. Even in our great country, we have the Incas, we had the Aztec civilization. You think about it, they're born, they lived, and they died. And in modern times, today we could say, you look at the history of China. China 30 years ago wasn't even a superpower, were they? But now they are. In the 80s, 70s, who was a superpower? Russia. They're on decline, right? Nations are born, they live, and they die. Every nation has that curve, right? And this is the time of the Gentiles, and this is what will happen to each of these nations. Except the last one that's reborn, Christ comes and demolishes the whole program and says, enough with that, I'm setting up my kingdom, right? So he does that. All right. So with that about nations, here's the amazing thing. It says there that, let me just read verses 1-3 here. And I'm going to give you some words you could write down here if you want. I'll give you a key verse if you're following there in the sheet. All of these words I'm going to give you begin with the letter P. You can write them in your Bible if you want. Besides, it just kind of helps you break this up. There's many different ways that people have done this in the past. This is the one I like the most. The very first thing in verses 1-3, we have a promotion happening. A promotion. You have 120 satraps appointed over the kingdom, right? Verse 2, and over them 3 commissions, of whom Daniel was one, that these satraps might be accountable to them, and that the king might not suffer loss. So one thing we see here about Darius is that he's an amazing organizer, right? He knows how to administrate, set up a kingdom, appoint people, and hold them accountable. All those things are being done here by him. And then it says that Daniel there, he was even one of them. We'll talk about what that could mean here in a minute. Let me read verse 3. Then this Daniel began distinguishing himself among the commissioners and satraps because he possessed an extraordinary spirit, and the king planned to appoint him over the entire kingdom. This is Daniel. He does it again, right? Absolutely incredible. Now, let me just talk about this. Daniel was a prime minister of Babylon, and he will be equally the prime minister of the Medes and the Persians. He became third ruler at the end of Belshazzar's reign. Now, he's really kind of second in charge again. There he is, an excellent statesman, Daniel. So what I'm seeing here in this is this. Nations come, nations go, but God works continues to grow. kind of rhyme. And it does, and that's the whole thing that's the driving part behind this. No nation is really significant when it's set against the backdrop of God's divine program, right? There's no nation that's really significant. What's significant is God's program and God's sovereignty over the affairs of man. Isn't that what Nebuchadnezzar came to the conclusion of? What verse was that when Nebuchadnezzar proclaimed that? The sovereignty of God over the nations. You can go back and look at that. Chapter 4 there, verse 34. At the end of that period, I, Nebuchadnezzar, raised my eyes toward heaven. My reason returned to me. I blessed the Most High. I praised and honored him who lives forever. For his dominion is what? An everlasting dominion. His kingdom endures from generation to generation. What's he getting a glimpse of here? Is that God's program is paramount. Everything else is secondary. What's happening in the United States is not foremost. It's secondary, right? What's happening on the world scenes with nations and their rise and their fall, that's all secondary. The most important thing is God's program, right? And it's exciting living in these times where we get to see some of this. And as we edge closer to the return of Christ, right, we can see, hey, God's program, it's still moving forward. A verse, maybe a key verse, if you want to write this down on your sheet, or maybe there at chapter 6, Isaiah chapter 40, verse 15. So let's just go there for a second. Isaiah chapter 40, verse 15, a key verse out of the main text, but I think it bears a lot onto the text. Isaiah 40, verse 15 says, behold, the nations are like a drop from a bucket and are regarded as a speck of dust. An interesting statement. Nations are just like a drop in a bucket. Probably the best word to describe this is inconsequential. They really don't matter. They come and they go. They rise and they fall. They're if you put them on a scale, they really don't amount to much. That's kind of amazing part of it all. So what is important is God's divine program. The nations are drops. They are dust. Now, back in Isaiah chapter 40 again, verses 7 and 8, it says this: the grass withers, the flowers fades. When the breath of the Lord blows upon it, surely the people are grass, right? We remember those verses there. And then it says there in verse 8, the grass withers, the flowers fades, but the word of our God stands forever. When it comes to people, the word of God stands forever. When it comes to nations, the program of God stands forever. So you have the people and you have the program of God. Really neat when you think about it like that. And Daniel, let me just take you back to Daniel chapter 4. Remember Nebuchadnezzar, this was this sentence. Remember his disease here. This sentence is by the decree of an angelic watchers. And the decision is a command of the holy ones, in order that the living may know that the Most High is ruler over what? The realms of mankind. And he what? Bestows it on whomever he wishes. Now that's really neat there. So God rules history. Nations come, nations go, but God has a redemptive plan that he's rolling out his schedule. The people go through this whole thing. Now, Nebuchadnezzar, his name inscribed on the bricks. And you can find bricks with Nebuchadnezzar's name all over them. One brick, which is in the British Museum, has the image of the name of Nebuchadnezzar. But you know what's over his name? A dog footprint. Seriously. Nations come, nations go, right? I mean, the greatest kingdoms of the world just come crumbling down. So that's how it is with men. That's how it is with nations. It's really about God and what God is doing. So coming back here to this, he sets over in Daniel chapter 6. He sets over 120 satraps. Now they are territorial leaders, right? They're chiefs, of whom Daniel, as it says there, was first, or my version says was one of them. And that's kind of what it means there. So you could see it as Daniel's ahead of him, or Daniel's still one of them, but Daniel's still going to distinguish himself from them, right? So it really doesn't matter how you interpret that, of whom Daniel was one or of whom Daniel was first. Kind of means the same thing. It could be one of the group or first in the group. It really doesn't matter, because the next verse kind of just puts it all into place for us. Then this Daniel began to distinguish himself among the commissioners. Now, let me just talk a little bit about Darius here for a minute. Who is Darius? History is quite silent about him, really quite silent. Some scholars feel that Darius's name was Gubaro, who wasn't really a king, but he was someone appointed under Cyrus in the area of Babylon. Some people take that view. You could do that, but I think there's a better explanation than believing it's Gubaro. I believe Darius is another name for Cyrus himself. And Darius is just a title, just another name or title for Cyrus. Now, I'll tell you why I think this is the best explanation. Just like, as you go back into history and look at Egypt, you have pharaohs, right? So it gets confusing. Which one's Pharaoh? Which one's the one Pharaoh? Because they're all called Pharaoh, right? Or which one's a king? They're all called kings. Or so it's a title. And why I think it's a title, if there's one person, if this other guy was appointed over Babylon, would you really need 120 satraps, territorials over just a city? Just doesn't seem right? So it seems like this is a greater, Darius is another name, a title for Cyrus. We find in the scriptures the word Darius. Now, archaeology has found at least 5 different Persian rulers. And guess who they're called? Darius. There's 5 of them. So that's why I think Darius is more of a title, right? Just kind of makes sense to me. And if you look at chapter 6, verse 8, it says there, "Now, O king, establish the injunction and sign the document." So here he's called a king, right? So I think that this Darius is no other than Cyrus, which really is predominant. So now he's not going to be as big as Nebuchadnezzar. He was the head of gold. But Darius is just, I believe, another word for Cyrus. Now, so Daniel prospers under the reign of Darius, or if I could use my interpretation there, of Cyrus. And, Cyrus is the Persian king. Now, all right, so with all that, you find Darius sets up 120 princesses. So it seems much more bigger than local Babylon. So, and moving on here then to what he does here. Daniel was one, going back to verse 2. Daniel was one, or we could see first. It's hard to distinguish what all that means there. Verse 3, though, Daniel distinguished himself. That means Daniel is preferred by Cyrus, if I can say that, over all the other leaders in Babylon. Preferred is an Aramaic participle, which means he was distinguishing himself constantly over the other people. Now, how did he do that? First of all, going back to Daniel, talking about him for a minute, the Bible says what in verse 3, that there was an excellent spirit in him, right? An excellent spirit among the commissioners, satraps, because he possessed an excellent and extraordinary spirit. What does that mean? Well, it means his attitude. Sometimes you can have good people, but they have a bad attitude, right? I think Donald Trump, that was kind of his downfall, right? Just didn't rub everyone correctly. And they say that attitude pervades everything else, right? You can have somebody good at their job, but if they have a bad attitude, you really don't like them. You might go to them, but you don't care for them, right? So attitude. What else did Daniel have? Well, at this point, as I mentioned before, he's 90 years old. He has experience, right? He knows Babylon now. Babylon is, I won't call it his home, because he still longed for his home, didn't he? Still cared about his people, but he saw it as a place where God has put him. And he finds a way to excel there. So he has attitude in a good way, and he had experience, and he had wisdom, didn't he? Going back to Daniel chapter 1. He had leadership ability, is running well, right? So if we were going to elect the next president, I vote for Daniel, right? Hands down, I vote for Daniel. And it says there that he had an extraordinary spirit, and the king planned to appoint him over the entire kingdom. Why? Not only did he have all those things, we know that Daniel had the ability to interpret dreams and visions, enigmas and riddles. Daniel could kind of do it all. All right, so in the first year of Cyrus's reign, which was around 538 or 537 BC, he made a decree to let God's people go from Babylon and return back home. Now, there's other books of the Bible that talk about this, and I alluded to it in Sunday school before, and it's really interesting. So if this Darius is Cyrus, who I think he is, who do you think influenced him to let God's people go back home? I think Daniel. Kind of neat when you think about that. Now, Daniel, as I mentioned before, he's pushing 90 years old, and he's still God's man in that place. That's incredible. So, Phyllis, this is for you. We know you went to the doctor. You announced that, and Daniel was pushing 90 years old. Now, Dr. Criswell at Dallas First Baptist, who was a great preacher in the South, and Robert G. Lee had his 84th birthday, which was in 1970. And he was asked this question: "Are you going to keep preaching, Dr. Lee?" This is what he replied: When there are so many unsaved people around, when there are cowering hearts to be comforted, when so many young people are throwing their lives away to folly and carnal pleasure, when there are so many evils against which to protest, when so many old people are lonely on the Sunset Trail, when in 1910, he says, at my ordination, I was married to preaching until death do us part. Kind of remarkable, right? And you find people today who just wants to get out, retire, take an easy life. That's not Daniel, is it? Daniel is in Babylon for his life, right? He knows it. The other people are returning back. Daniel's not going to get out of Babylon. He's going to stay there until he dies. Here's some other interesting statistics here for you. Dr. Lee added some fortifying statistics. He said this. It was presented by Newman Darlin, a scholar, and he analyzed the lives and achievements of 400 foremost characters of history. Now listen to this. The analysis shows that nearly 80 of the world's greatest figures closed active lives that they achieved their greatest between the age of 58 and 80. Can you believe that? 25% continued beyond 70, 22.5% beyond 80, and 6% beyond 90. So think of it like this. Edison was still inventing when he was at the age of 90. Wright was also considered a creative architect. Famous playwriters were at age 90. J.C. Penney's, the great Christian, was working strenuously at his desk at the age of 95. And we got Biden in the office working. I mean, you think he's our oldest president. And if he had the right leadership skills, I think he would do really good. He has a lot of experience, right? And he's accomplishing a lot. Believe it or not, for his age, he's accomplishing a lot. Whether we like what he's accomplishing or not is something different. But let's be honest. He has now appointed more federal judges than I think Trump did. He's on pace to exceed him. So he has an end. Even though you might hear all the negative things and how they're not doing anything at the border, believe me, he's doing everything he wants to do. He is. So just because we get older doesn't mean life's over, right? That's good news, isn't it? Right. And here's Daniel, because sometimes you read this and you think, really, Daniel's 90 years. What could he be doing now? You know what I mean? What good is he? He was still good enough, even at that time, that Cyrus appoints him over the kingdom. So it's not unbelievable that this has happened. This has happened throughout history, right? So when we read this, we don't just read it and think, oh, this is just a made-up story. No one could be this old in a lion's den, and nobody could elevate themselves that much in life. It's possible, and that's why in verses 1 through 3, we have what's called the promotion. The promotion. So that's what we have there. In verse 4, then the commissioners and the satraps began trying to find a ground of accusation in regard to government affairs, but they could not find no ground of accusation or evidence or corruption, inasmuch as he was faithful, and no negligence or corruption was to be found in him. So what we have happening here is that when this promotion happened to Daniel, guess what also happens? Envy. Anytime anyone is ever promoted in life, what do you find? Envy and jealousy. You find it in anything in life. Let me just bring up a name, Tom Brady. Why do people hate Tom Brady? Let's be honest, because he's good. right? Anytime anyone is elevated, there's always that jealousy and envy that begins to happen. Um, and we have to be careful about that because, you know, um, let me just say this. There's no exaltation and there's no success in life without a degree of slavery. The man who succeeds at his work, the man who slaves and labors, I want you to know this, he's chained. What do I mean by that? Well, take for instance, if someone is a musician, guess what? They're fastened to the guitar or their piano, right? If you want to be great at something, you become chained to it, right? You become obsessive compulsive people become very great people in life, right? The guitarist down at Music Emporium, he said every great guitarist was an obsessive compulsive. It's true. If you're an artist, guess what? You're fastened to your canvas, right? For example, Michelangelo did his greatest paintings at age 90. If you're an author, you're glued to your manuscripts. With everything in life, anybody who wants to excel at anything, you make yourself a prisoner to it. That's what you do. And you pour your life into it. So now let me just say this. In Philippians chapter 1, Paul was a prisoner, right? And guess what? His ministry is going well, but guess what? People get jealous. And then they wanted to make him feel worse now that he was in prison. Why? Jealousy and envy, right? It brings out those things in people. So here's Daniel. He's appointed over the entire kingdom, verse 3. Then, verse 4, do you see the progression? When someone's appointed above somebody else, what begins to happen? Jealous. We saw that before with all the leaders under Nebuchadnezzar. Now with these newly appointed ones, Daniel's like, I've seen this all before, right? Different group of people, but kind of the same thing. Get this. In London, a contemporary was with young Charles Spurgeon. This contemporary was a much older preacher, and he's been in that city for a generation. He spent his life laboring, faithfully ministering to the people, and along came Charles Haddon Spurgeon in London. And when he arrived in London, they said it just boomed with Charles Haddon Spurgeon. People just were drawn to him. They flocked to him. And you know what? Did you ever stop to think about what the other ministers in that area thought? I've been laboring here my whole life. I've been doing this and couldn't get the people out. And the story is told of an older minister, and this is a true story here. And this comes from some books here, and rather, this older minister said this. He said that he began to get envy and jealousy begin to enter my heart, and it began to eat me up. There was a famous preacher in London, but the throngs were all listening to Spurgeon. And the older pastor said he got on his knees, he cried out to God, and he told the Lord all about it. He did. And then the Lord began to put praise in his heart and intercession and pleading for the young man Spurgeon. And he said this, and here's a quote. The day came after I prayed and took it to God, when upon every victory Spurgeon won, I felt as if I've done it myself because I was praying for him. There's envy and there's jealousy. Not many people would be like that older minister there. There was many other pastors in London who hated Charles Spurgeon because he was popular. They were not. So now when Daniel's 90, guess what? He becomes popular again, right? In charge of the entire kingdom, an honorable place there. And what they found, and get this, in politics, this is really amazing. They found that there was nothing they could accuse him of. There's no fault that they could find with him. Now, that really had to get them, right? That means no sins of commission or no sins of omission. They couldn't find anything that he shouldn't have done and anything that he did do. Verse 5. Then these men said, we shall not find any ground of accusation against Daniel unless we find it against him with regard to the law of his God. Now they found ground. They're like, you know what? He's too religious. This is going to be his downfall, right? How many heard that said before? You're too religious. It's going to be your downfall in life. Well, that's never true here. And so what we find here is that Daniel is going to literally suffer for righteousness' sake, right? 1 Peter 3:14 says about suffering for righteousness' sake. But the thing is, many times we suffer for our own incompetence, our own stupidity, our own half faults. Many times we suffer because we're part of the blame and we're part of the problem and not the solution, right? Let's be honest. How many fall into that category? Daniel suffered for righteousness' sake. There was nothing they could find in him. Now, they found a lot of dirt on Kavanaugh that they brought up, right? Some of it was made up. Some of it was half lies. He did go to drinking parties and things like that. And they made a big deal about that. And that's a big deal. Belshazzar was at a drinking party that had an abrupt ending. But here they found nothing. Daniel wasn't at the drinking party, was he? They had to bring him in. Verse 6. Then these commissioners and the satraps came by agreement to the king and spoke to him as follows. King Darius live forever. So there's all the proper greetings. We heard all this stuff before, all the ways to address a king. All the commissioners of the kingdom, the prefects, the satraps, the high officials, and the governors have consulted together that the king should establish a statute and enforce an injunction that anyone who makes a petition to any god or man besides you, O king, for 30 days shall be cast into the lion's den. So all those commissioners there and counselors, they come together, and what did they do? They stroked Cyrus's ego. They said, we think you are leading so well, right? This is a great trap. You want to get someone to fall in life, just keep filling them up with pride, right? I'm serious. It was the downfall of Nebuchadnezzar, downfall of Belshazzar, and here Darius. He's a good man, but he's going to make a horrible mistake here because for 30 days, he's going to be God. You heard the saying before, queen for a day. Well, he's king for 30 days, and it turns into a fiasco. It does. So they basically come and say to him, look, because you're such a great leader here and you're such a great administrator, and since you have really kind of restored Babylon and all this stuff, let's just make a petition now that nobody praises anyone but you for 30 days. And now notice that they lied. Notice verse 7. All the commissioners of the kingdom agreed to this. That's not true. Who wouldn't have agreed to that? Daniel, especially. This was a plot. This was suffering for righteousness' sake. They come and they devise this plan, which is a lie. They found no fault in him, but they're the ones with fault. Verse 8. Now, O king, establish the injunction and sign it, the document, so that it may not be changed according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which may not be revoked. Now, they were very strict on laws. They were a country of law and order. When they signed a law, they took the time to think about it and said, this will not be revoked. Once we establish a law, it will be established. And they knew that. And they bring this form to him and told him how great he was and asked him to sign it. And it says there in verse 9, therefore, King Darius signed the document, that is the injunction. So when you're elected to be God, that is going to be bad. And that's what they elected him as now. So he gets to be God. In verse 6, they assembled together. In Aramaic, that means they came hastily and tumultuously. It's kind of like they were a group that was milling as they came in, right? They were so excited about coming in before the king because they wanted rid of Daniel because of envy and jealousy. So they came in to pull off their lie, and they said all the priests, all the commissioners, right? All of them have decided this. Now, when it does say there, all the commissioners, the word commissioners means kind of presidents, all the presidents. That's kind of the word there. It's kind of interesting. But so they established then that, you know what, you're going to be worshiped. Now, you might think to ourselves here for a minute, wait a second, this sounds so weird. Why would they really make a proclamation like this? Why would Darius even sign something like this, even if they're stroking his ego? Remember this, that deities of false gods are not infallible. Man knows that. Remember I said when we studied idolatry in here that when man creates an idol, the idol is a representation of himself. So you don't have to be perfect to be a god in man's eyes. You can be made out of a statue. You can have imperfections. Their gods were not perfect. Perfection is something that was only reserved for the true God. So, you didn't have perfect deities. That didn't make sense. Even on Mars Hills, and when Paul went there with Athens, and you have all these gods, they didn't believe those gods were perfect. They accepted them with all their faults. It's kind of interesting, isn't it? So it's not a huge step here for Darius to become a god for 30 days. Well, remember, even in Egypt, they called the pharaohs, and Pharaoh's son was what? A god. So did the insurrection at the White House, looked up to Trump as a god. I believe that. Why would you storm that building, right? I thought that was just wrong. What were they thinking? They were thinking, hey, whatever Trump says is as good as gold, right? They elevated him to a spot where they should have never elevated him in their minds. That was wrong. What happened? That was horrendous. That was an attack on the Capitol, and I'm a Republican, I'm saying that, right? But it was absolutely wrong. If it was Democrats that did it, we would all be furious at them, right? Anyone who does that type of thing should be held accountable, right? I read one of the guys fled to another country. Did you see that? So I don't know if he'll be able to live near Bulgaria or somewhere like that. But no, I think those people should be held responsible. We don't elevate people to that status. That's what's happening here. They're elevating him, and he's accepting that. So it was a problem with history, really, where monarchs take on almost a role. Caesars, all those kind of take on a role of like a deity almost. Well, Darius was flattered, so he gets it. He wasn't thinking. He's swept away by the emotion of the deal. He signs a very concrete law that cannot be revoked. How much time do we have? We're about out of time, aren't we? So, all right, I guess. Let me just get out of verse 10, the plot. The plot. Now, when Darius knew that the document was signed, he entered his house. Now, in the roof chamber, he had Daniel knew the document was signed. He entered his house. Now, on the roof chamber, he had windows open toward Jerusalem, and he continued kneeling on his knees 3 times a day, praying, giving thanks before his God, as he has been doing previously, right? This is perseverance here by Daniel. He's praying. Now, he didn't just decide, guess what I'm going to do? I'm going to make a show of this, and I'm going to show them that they're not going to stop me. I'm going to just open up my windows and pray to God. He didn't do that. And you just can't turn Christianity on and off in your life. Did you realize that? You just can't. It's either on or it's off. You just can't turn it. Daniel's doing this because this is who Daniel is. So we're going to stop there. We pick up. I thought we'd get a lot further today. You guys are talking about the train too long. Yeah, should have got some of that time back. All right, let's pray, and we will resume here next week then. Father, thank you so much that you, Lord, in your sovereignty, you do raise people up. You appoint people. Nations are like just a drop in a bucket before you. We know, God, that your plan of sovereignty and how you lead in your program is a program we want to be on track on with our life. That's where the blessings come from. That's where the excitement happens, seeing you at work. Lord, we pray that you would work through us. We pray that you would raise up Daniels in our generation to take the reins again. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen.